Welcome back to the Steely Dan 64 project. This is a series of videos where I'm sharing my personal ranking of the 64 songs released by Steely Dan during their classic period from 1972 to 1980. My foundational premise is this: not one of these 64 songs sucks, but I do enjoy some more than others. Let's talk about the songs I ranked at numbers 40 through 33. Thanks for dropping by. I'm Swan Shadow, this is The Nest. Of course, if you've already subscribed, you know that. And if you haven't, well, there's a hint. In today's video, we're going to cover the 8 songs that come in at numbers 40 through 33 in my personal ranking of Steely Dan's 64 classic period songs. If you're curious as to which songs landed further down the list, there are links to the previous videos in this series in the description below. Just a reminder, this ranking is strictly a representation of one person's opinions about these songs, coming from someone, that's me, who's been an avid Steely Dan fan since the 1970s. Your evaluation of and opinions about these songs can, will, and indeed should be different from mine. To quote the great Dave Mason, there ain't no good guy, there ain't no bad guy. There's only you and me, and we just disagree. And you know what? There's not a thing wrong with that. Enough preamble. Let's get into my song number 40. Song number 40 is Any World That I'm Welcome To, the 9th track on Steely Dan's 1975 album, Katy Lied. Here's proof, in case you actually needed it, that Walter Becker and Donald Fagen were capable of writing a straightforward pop song when they were of a mind to do so. Of course, it stops being straightforward at the moment you realize that the tasteful backbeat is being supplied by perhaps the greatest session drummer in the history of recorded music, the one and only Hal Blaine. If you have to find a last-minute fill-in for Jeff Porcaro, who handled the drumming duties on the rest of Katy Lied, you could do worse than Hal Blaine. In fact, pretty much anyone else you got would be worse than Hal Blaine. Blaine enjoyed a career unlike that of any other drummer before or since. Between 1966 and 1971, he played on every song that won the Grammy for Record of the Year. That's 6 consecutive winners of the top Grammy prize. In total, Blaine played on 150 songs that hit the Billboard Top 10. 39 of those went to number 1. Blaine was in such demand as a session drummer that he had a rubber stamp made that read, "Hal Blaine Strikes Again," which he used to mark the walls of every studio where he played a session. It's estimated that Blaine performed on more than 35,000 recordings, including Any World That I'm Welcome To, his one and only appearance on a Steely Dan record. Speaking of which, I've always identified with the sense of wistful alienation embodied in this song, that feeling of not quite belonging and yearning for a place where one truly could belong. I keep hoping that someday I'll find that world where I'm welcome. Song number 39 is Bodhisattva, the opening track on Steely Dan's second album, Countdown to Ecstasy. Now, I know that a lot of you will have Bodhisattva much higher in your personal rankings, and that's okay. But one of the things I love most about Steely Dan is Becker and Fagen's trademark lyrical creativity, and there's just not enough of that in this song for me. That said, for what it is, Bodhisattva is still pretty darn good. It's basically a riff-off between the band's 2 guitarists, Denny Dias and Jeff "Skunk" Baxter. And yes, Steely Dan was still an actual band at the time of this second album. It's a terrific showcase for the technical virtuosity of these 2 fine guitar players. I would just enjoy the song a little bit more had Becker and Fagen squeezed just a couple more verses in between the jams. Gotta say though, it is a track that rocks. Song number 38 is Change of the Guard, track 9 on Steely Dan's 1972 debut album, Can't Buy a Thrill. As we've discussed in earlier installments, at the time of the band's first studio album, Donald and Walter were still figuring out exactly what they wanted Steely Dan to be. And no doubt their record label had some ideas about that as well. For the latter reason, we get a lot more compact, potentially radio-friendly numbers on Can't Buy a Thrill than the boys would serve up later in their career. But when you can turn Skunk Baxter loose to rip a couple of guitar solos to shreds, there's nothing wrong with just letting it rock. Skunk serves up a taste here of the licks he'd later make famous as the Doobie Brothers' lead guitar slinger. There's something inherently buoyant about Fagen's electric piano riffs here. They serve to give this song a much more upbeat feel than the typically moody Steely Dan fare that would characterize their albums later in this run. Also, we get a dose of David Palmer sharing the lead vocal with Fagen. His lighter tone is particularly well suited to a tune like this one. A change of the guard was coming, though. Palmer would be out the door by the time of the group's second album. Song number 37 is The Boston Rag, track number 3 on the album Countdown to Ecstasy, released in 1973. I appreciate the songs from Steely Dan's early albums that open a window into the musical direction that Becker and Fagen would ultimately pursue. There's just enough postmodern jazz floating through this mishmash of a track to hint at what lay ahead. And by mishmash, I mean there's a lot going on here, and not all of the pieces seem as though they were intended from the start to fit together. For example, where does that weird, almost theremin-like guitar part played by Denny Dias in the bridge come from? Certainly not Boston. And why is there pedal steel just barely audible in the second verse? I don't know. In retrospect, however, you can listen to this tune through the lens of, say, The Royal Scam 3 years later, and you think, okay, now I see where this is going. It ain't no drag. That's for certain. Song number 36 is Sign In Stranger, track number 4 on the 1976 album The Royal Scam. A round of applause, please, for the piano man. Paul Griffin, probably best known for his contributions to Bob Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited and Don McLean's American Pie, takes a seat at the keyboard and lets his fingers dance all over this bouncy little number. Griffin's piano solo alone merits the price of admission, but his easygoing background fills propel the verses just as nicely. It's not the last time we'll hear from Mr. Griffin on The Royal Scam. We'll hear him rock the clavinet on Kid Charlemagne and manly electric piano, and earn a rare co-writing credit alongside Becker and Fagen on The Fez. We also get some clever note bending here from Elliot Randall on guitar, and some robust contributions from the horn section. But it's Paul Griffin's tickling of the ivories that makes this one special. Song number 35 is Your Gold Teeth, the 4th track on the 1973 album Countdown to Ecstasy. Back in my college days, when a Steely Dan album was spinning on my turntable practically all the time, I expended a fair bit of effort trying to track down the various references that pop up in Steely Dan lyrics. I still recall trekking to the library in those pre-internet times to listen to a recording by Kathy Berberian, out of curiosity born from endless listening to Your Gold Teeth. It was an exercise I did not feel compelled to repeat, but I was happy that now the song made sense. Clocking in at just 1 second shy of 7 minutes, Your Gold Teeth is the longest track in the Steely Dan repertoire to this point. It would hold that record until the title track from Asia and its album mate, Deacon Blues, surpassed it 4 years later. It doesn't overstay its welcome, though. Dumb luck might not suck me in this time, but Your Gold Teeth certainly does. Song Song number 34 is Dirty Work, the second track on the 1972 debut, Can't Buy a Thrill. Dirty Work serves as a prime example of how one's musical perspective evolves over time. When I was first developing an affinity for Steely Dan, Dirty Work was one of my least favorite tracks, mostly because I despised David Palmer's quavery, borderline saccharine lead vocal. As a more mature listener, however, I gained the ability to get past my distaste for that specific performance and appreciate the underlying song on its own merits. In particular, hearing Dirty Work as Fagen's current touring version of Steely Dan now performs it live, with a trio of female backing vocalists taking over the leads, gave me renewed affection for it. I'm still not a David Palmer fan. His label-enforced presence remains for me the weakest element of Can't Buy a Thrill. But I've grown to like this charming, subtly subversive little ditty quite a bit. This is another one I fear that I might have ranked a little too low. But there's just too much awesomeness ahead for me to move it up. Closing out this episode is song number 33, the title track from Steely Dan's 1976 album, The Royal Scam. For me, The Royal Scam, the album, not just its titular song, represents the moment when Steely Dan first achieved its full potential, when Becker and Fagen's mad vision completely coalesced. Every album prior to this one moved a step forward, away from the quirky, eclectic pop rock band of Can't Buy a Thrill, and toward the jazz rock, session legends melange powerhouse that peaked with Asia. On The Royal Scam, Steely Dan arrived. This track, which closes the album, is Walter and Donald saying, like the Caribbean immigrants whose tale the lyrics tell, "We're here. See the glory indeed." With that, we are halfway through the ranking. 32 songs down, 32 yet to go. And as incredible as the music has been up to this point, it's only going to become more fantastic as we forge ahead. In our next episode, we'll begin at song number 32 and climb to number 25. You'll find a link to that video in the description below when the episode's good to go. As always, if you're enjoying this cruise through the Steely Dan 64, please tap that thumbs up to like this video. And while your hand's on the mouse, hit that subscribe button so you'll be sure to see all of our future content. It's much appreciated. Until next time, be well and stay steely. And hey, is there gas in the car? Yes, there's gas in the car.